Hi everyone. Let's learn how to play the French defense as black. So the French defense is e4, e6. The purpose of e6 is to support a pawn push to d5 to engage white's center. We don't want to play d5 right away, which is the Scandinavian defense. This allows white to draw our queen out. So instead we protect the d5 square with a pawn move. So after d4, d5, if white ever exchanges on d5, we're ready to capture back with a pawn. So we would like to keep a strong pawn in the center. So this is the standard position that the French defense usually begins with, and there are a number of moves white can make here. So black is attacking the e4 pawn, and very common moves are to defend it with knight to c3 or knight to d2, or somewhat rare is bishop to d3 to defend the pawn. Also common is exchanging it. It's called the exchange French. Or in this video, we're going to look at e5, the advanced French, just pushing it forward. This is actually the most common move in the Lichess amateur database, with the exchange French a close second. And it creates this locked pawn center here. And this particular pawn configuration occurs in a lot of variations of the French. Eventually, white does often push the pawn forward to e5. And so it pays to study this advanced variation first, so we see this pawn structure in its purest form. And then we can use some of the ideas we learn in the advanced French to help us understand the other variations as well. Okay, so what has white accomplished with this move? Well, he's gained more space in the center. He's cramping black's position. He's controlling the f6 square, so we don't have this natural square for our knight. And because our pawns are locked on these light squares here, our light squared bishop is currently a bad bishop, called the bad French bishop. We'll have some plans for dealing with that bishop, though. Often it can come out by playing b7 and maybe even go to the a6 square. Sometimes it goes to d7 and then over to b5 and maybe exchanges itself. Sometimes we push the pawn to f6 and the bishop comes out by this long route like that. So there are a lot of ways, a number of opportunities to make that bishop more active. Okay, in this position, black has to attack white's center. He cannot leave the pawns like this. He'll be too cramped. And black has two pawn breaks. The primary pawn break, which he does first, is c5, attacking the d4 square. The secondary pawn break is f6, attacking the e5 square. So f6 is normally only played under favorable circumstances because it can weaken the black king. This diagonal in particular can become weak. So we begin by playing our primary pawn break c5. Now it's advisable that white protects d4 with a pawn. If he doesn't and he plays some other move like knight f3, then we're simply going to take that pawn on d4. And so the e5 pawn becomes a little weaker than it used to be, and white's center is not as strong. In fact, without a white pawn on d4, our d5 pawn may become mobile, and that actually makes our bad French bishop a little less bad. It may have some scope along that diagonal later. So if possible, if white allows it, you want to snap off that pawn on d4. But most often, white will play c3 in the position, guarding with a pawn. Okay, so our plan in this position is to pressurize this d4 point as much as we can. Our focus is on this weak d4 point in white's camp. And the most natural way to begin doing that is knight c6, developing a piece towards the center. The most common reply is knight f3, getting closer to kingside castling, developing a piece, and strengthening both of white's central dark squares. Okay, there are two main moves in this position. One of them is the move queen to b6 to put further pressure on the d4 pawn. This move also puts pressure on b2, keeping the dark squared bishop at home. But there's another move we're going to recommend here, which is the move bishop to d7. Now, there are a lot of reasons to make a case for this move. First of all, it's a good waiting move. It waits to see how the game will unfold, because sometimes this queen goes to the b6 square. In fact, it often does, in order to put more pressure on d4. But in some cases, it may want to go to the c7 square to pressure e5, especially after we make our secondary pawn break f6 and we may exchange pawns on e5. Then a queen makes more sense on c7, since the main target will shift from d4 over to e5. So we wait. We play bishop to d7 before we commit our queen. There are other reasons to make this move. Another reason is sometimes this bishop may get out to the b5 square pretty soon, maybe supported by a queen on b6, and we may be able to trade off that bad light squared bishop. Yet another reason is it opens up the c8 square. Black often exchanges pawns on d4, opening the c-file, and then the black rook can come to c8. So it's a multi-purpose move. The bishop usually ends up on d7 anyway, so we go ahead and do it now. Okay, so we'll look at four possible responses here. I did notice there were some grandmaster games with this strange-looking move, d takes c5. If white plays that, we're just going to take back with our dark squared bishop. This helps our development. White's center is a little bit weaker than it used to be, and we should plan for our secondary pawn break f6 soon. So that looks like nothing to worry about. In fact, to my eyes, to my amateur eyes, it looks like a mistake that white made. Okay, another move we'll look at is a rare gambit, bishop to d3. This often transposes into a gambit, I should say, called the Milner-Berry gambit. And it goes like this. If we see bishop to d3, we'll go ahead and exchange on d4, play queen to b6, putting more pressure on d4, and white often castles here, gambiting that d4 pawn. This position is sometimes reached through a different move order, so we've actually transposed into this Milner-Berry gambit. And it's a gambit because we can win the pawn on d4, and it is safe to do so. And now notice there's even yet another reason our bishop is on d7. If it were not on d7 right now, white would have the tactic bishop to b5 check with a discovered attack on our queen. So our queen is actually safe there thanks to this bishop on d7. And play often goes knight c3, offering yet a second pawn, but I think it is too dangerous to take that, and a good move here is simply a6 to keep the white pieces off the b5 square. So this gambit I think is a bit dubious for white, and we are fine in this position. So going back to white's sixth move here, after we play our waiting move bishop to d7, another move that's very common, it's almost a main line, is a3. The purpose of that is to expand on the queen side with pawn to b4, but it's a bit slow. It does nothing to further white's development. And since white is just making a pawn move on the side of the board, we should really strike in the center, and it's the perfect time for our secondary pawn break, f6. Okay, now black does have to be careful when he makes this pawn break, because as I said earlier, it does weaken his king. You have this diagonal pretty weak. This square on e6 is weaker than it used to be, but white doesn't really have enough development, enough pieces to attack us right now, so it's a perfectly reasonable plan, f6. If white takes on f6, we're happy to take back with the knight. That's usually what you want to do. And then the plan is pretty simple. You're going to put your bishop on d6. You're going to castle short. you're going to put your queen on c7 and make a nice battery here, and your pieces are getting a lot of activity. I much prefer black in that position. Now, if white doesn't take, he can try to expand on the queen side, as we mentioned earlier, with b4. In that case, we will take on e5. That's usually what you do when you play f6. If white allows it, you take on e5. And we'll look at two moves here. If white takes, we'll look at three moves actually. If white takes with the knight, we'll continue to exchange until we bring a pawn to e5, which becomes a target after queen to c7. So now white's center again has been broken down. There's no more pawn on d4, and e5 becomes our new target. Or going back, white may not exchange knights. He may simply play d takes e5, in which case we'll still play queen to c7 and target that weak e5 point. But another interesting move in this position after f takes e5 is the move b5, pushing forward, attacking our knight. There is a strong and surprising continuation for black. It's a piece sacrifice. Knight takes d4. White accepts the piece. We take back with the pawn, and we have this mass of pawns in the center of the board here that is very difficult for white to deal with. Black's plan is to play moves that are very natural developing moves like bishop d6, knight f6, castling short, and start to push those pawns in the center. So it's a good position for black to play. Okay, so going all the way back again to white's sixth move, the most popular move played by masters here is the move bishop to e2. So unlike that Milner-Berry gambit, the bishop is not blocking the queen's defense of d4 by coming to d3. Instead, it goes to e2 more modestly, in which case our plan is to get the other knight into the action, play it to e7 with the intent of putting it on f5 to pressure d4 even further. And we can play queen to b6 as well in this position. If we do put the knight on f5, we don't have to fear it getting kicked away with g4. We'll just retreat it, and white's king side will be weaker, and it will be harder for him to castle there. And we'll have a pawn we can attack on g4. So that's nothing to worry about. Sometimes white may play d takes c5 in this position, since we just blocked our bishop's protection of that pawn. But that's a mistake. These pawns are all weak now, and black can continue with knight to g6 rather than knight to f5, since there's no point in the knight being on f5 anymore without a target on d4. So this pawn in the center is going to fall next, not to mention the pawn on c5 is under attack as well. So black is doing really well in this position. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a Grandmaster game. This is Shabalov versus Shirov from 2005. So Shirov is playing the black pieces here, and they play this advanced variation of the French, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, and the two moves here, remember, are queen b6, or as Shirov plays, bishop to d7, our nice waiting move. Okay, Shabalov plays perhaps the best move here, bishop to e2, and then knight ge7, just as we saw. And now a new move for us is knight to a3. The purpose of this move is to come back to the c2 square to lend further support to d4. So white is noticing that black is going to be piling up pressure on that d4 square. So the knight on c2 can help. And now here's a good rule of thumb. When you see white play the knight to the a3 square, you can go ahead and exchange pawns on d4. You do it now rather than earlier, because earlier, while the knight was sitting on b1, if we had exchanged pawns on d4, then the knight would have had the option of coming to c3. But after it goes to a3, then we exchange, the knight can no longer come to the c3 square. Okay, black continued with knight f5, and then the white knight did go back to c2 as intended. Okay, queen b6, putting further pressure on d4. White does currently have it sufficiently defended, so white castles. And now a very nice move, knight to a5. The purpose of this move is to release the bishop to come to b5 to a better diagonal, perhaps trading itself off, or if not, having more influence. Currently it's doing nothing on d7. Okay, another plan besides knight to a5 would have been something like bishop to e7, short castles, and then playing for that secondary pawn break. So that's another perfectly fine way to play. But knight a5 was played by Shirov, and now g4. Probably a mistake. The knight retreats, and now white's kingside is weaker, and the g4 pawn is going to be attacked with h5. It becomes a hook in white's position. Okay, knight f, e1 was played. White wants to expand with f4 at this point. Bishop b5, putting the bishop on the better diagonal as discussed. Knight d3, so white doesn't want to trade bishops there. So if black wants to, he can get rid of his bad bishop, but it's actually not so bad on this diagonal right now, so there's no hurry to give it up. Instead, black plays h5, attacking that g4 pawn. White takes it and gives up control of the f5 square, so the knight sinks in there and puts more pressure on d4. Bishop e3 defends. Now the knight on a5 is doing nothing there, so it goes back to where it was, putting more pressure on d4. a4 tickles the bishop moves forward, still doesn't trade itself. White expands on the queen side, and now an excellent move, queen to d8, transferring the queen nicely over to the king side for an attack. Bishop to g4 was played. Knight takes on e3. F takes back, and the queen goes to g5, pinning that g4 bishop. h3 defends the bishop, but the pawn on h5 is hanging thanks to the pin. Queen to f3, which is attacking the f7 square and lending some defensive support to the king side. But black simply castles long, gives up the f7 pawn, and plays rook takes h3, attacking further. Now, white does get some counterplay here, but black had it all worked out. Queen takes e6 check, the king steps aside, rook takes the bishop, and now black doesn't want to play rook takes rook because of the fork here. So instead, black plays rook to g3 check and then picks up the white bishop on g4. Okay, now queen d6, notice the rook is pinned on d8. King goes to the corner, and the rook takes the rook on d8. The knight takes back, defended by the queen. Queen goes to d7, threatening a mate on c8, but white never gets a time to enact that mate. So rook to g2 check, king falls back, queen g3 check, king d1, queen f3 check, and white has had enough. He resigns. The game might have continued like this. If king c1, I'll note that black had to find the only move in the position, which is rook takes c2 check. Not a hard move for a grandmaster to find. Breaking the defense. Queen comes in with a further check, king to c1. Queen takes the pawn, not the knight. We have to continue with checks since white has a mate threat on c8. King c2 finally gives up the knight with check. Notice that if the king went to b2, then there's a mate in 2 in the position. Check, and now either way the king goes, he's going to get mated. So king could go here. We could take the knight with check. King could go to c1, queen c3 check, king b1 protecting the rook. And now black can take his time and even play knight to c6 with the intent of blocking the mate with the knight on b8. The rook is stuck in the corner. Black has a material advantage and is still attacking the white king. It's a win. So excellent game by Shirov. I hope you learned something from it. I sure did. Thanks for watching this first video in our French defense series.